There were no military trucks, no camera crews, just a quiet envoy carrying a message no one fully understood. After years of watching from a distance, the sudden silence raises questions. Why now? What has changed? And why are they paying attention? It wasn't about punishments. There were no threats, no suspension, not even a formal action plan. Angola's top diplomat, Tete Antonio, arrived in Burkina Faso on behalf of the African Union. But this wasn't the usual loud diplomacy Africa is familiar with. This was quiet and intentional, enough to catch both observers and the country's military leaders off guard. But make no mistake, listening isn't a passive act in global politics. Often, silence speaks louder than military action. Antonio didn't come to hand down orders when he sat with Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Ouagadougou. He came to understand, to observe, and to report. And when the AU starts listening, it often means something deeper is at play. The African Union is at a crossroads. For years, its response to military coups followed a script: condemn, demand elections, threaten sanctions. But the recent wave of change in the Sahel tore that script apart. Instead of chaos, these coups sparked public support, regional defiance, and a fresh call for independence that traditional diplomacy couldn't quiet. With Burkina Faso now rejecting ECOWAS and distancing itself from the West, the AU's usual playbook seems out of touch. Antonio wasn't there to enforce rules. He came to hear what the new Sahel wants, and just as importantly, what it doesn't. Sources say the conversations behind closed doors focused on long-term vision rather than immediate elections or deadlines. So what does Africa look like after turning away from the West? In a region rewriting the rules of power and diplomacy, the AU must ask itself what role it can play. The leadership in Burkina Faso made their position clear. They're not interested in lectures from Addis Ababa. They're open to working together, but only if their independence, new partnerships, and demand for African-led solutions are respected. That leaves the AU in a tricky position. Western donors expect it to uphold democratic norms. At the same time, it is facing a rising group of African nations that want to define those norms for themselves. This mission wasn't about making decisions, it was about learning. The AU is trying to understand a new voice rising across the continent, a voice of rebellion, of pride, of reinvention. But listening doesn't mean doing nothing. This is strategic. Antonio wasn't just hearing opinions, he was identifying hopes, stress points, and opportunities for the AU to stay relevant without becoming outdated. There are quiet talks suggesting the AU may offer fresh types of support, including direct help to Sahel nations, intelligence sharing between members, and humanitarian aid that bypasses Western controls. None of this was officially confirmed, but behind the scenes, these ideas are very real. Antonio left with more than theories. He gathered insight into what might actually work on the ground. This wasn't about the AU taking control. It was about the AU trying not to lose its place at the table. The silence of this visit sent a message. Show us where you're headed, and we'll see if we can support you, or at least not block your path. Because if the AU doesn't evolve with the Sahel, it risks losing more than just one region. It could lose the right to speak for the whole continent. And that leads to an even bigger question. What is the African Union really hearing now that it has finally started to listen? And when one part of Africa stops asking for permission, what does that mean for the rest? Let's continue. You don't just fly into a place like Burkina Faso and sit across from a military leader unless something urgent is unfolding, something too serious to watch from afar. And what the African Union came to hear wasn't just another report of unrest or conflict. What they heard was a message from the region itself, A declaration, a clear signal that the old ways no longer hold. Anyone still defending the status quo is being seen as either stuck in the past or willfully ignoring the shift happening on the ground. Something powerful is building in the Sahel. The AU came to listen, maybe unprepared for what they would actually hear. What they found was a new way of thinking, spreading quietly but forcefully. A belief that Africa should no longer be asked to compromise under the appearance of diplomacy. A belief that relying on the West is not protection, but a kind of control. This view sees self-governance not as a nice phrase, but as a real and difficult struggle. Inside those meetings, Traoré and his advisors didn't sound like rebels. They sounded like builders. Their tone wasn't defensive. They weren't asking for help to stabilize the country. They were stating clearly, be ready for what's coming. Burkina Faso is not asking for advice. It is not interested in outdated systems, in elections tied to foreign funding, or in peace deals managed from European cities. According to the current leadership, and increasingly, many citizens in the Sahel, freedom doesn't come from ballots shaped by outside influence. It comes from owning the tools of survival and power: information, weapons, food, and land. And they're putting that system in place, slowly and confidently. The African Union, once a strong voice for unity, now finds it difficult to connect with this new and radical version of independence. Not because it disagrees with the idea, but because it never expected the push for change to throw out the entire rulebook. The mood has changed, from rural towns like Kaya to the capital streets of Ouagadougou. Traditional leaders, young organizers, and activists are all speaking a new kind of language. They're no longer asking for change. They expect it. Big plans are replacing foreign aid, state-owned gold refineries, military-led food programs, and training networks led by young people. The old requests for global help are being replaced with action. At the center of this movement is a belief that trust must be earned. No alliance, including with the AU, should be assumed. That's what Antonio was really listening to. And that's what made his visit so important. The Sahel's shift isn't just about ending foreign influence. It's testing the very idea of African unity. The African Union must now decide whether to embrace this raw, self-directed wave of independence or see it as a threat to the unity it was created to protect. That choice comes with risk. If the AU misunderstands this movement or treats it as a problem to fix, it could lose an entire generation of African nations who are determined to shape their own future. Worse, it could be seen as betraying its mission. From the Sahel's point of view, the AU might look like a slow, cautious institution afraid to let Africa grow beyond its old limits. But the AU is also hearing something else, something not said at press conferences, but whispered among soldiers, activists, and leaders. It's not fear of conflict, it's fear of being left behind. There's a deep concern that if this new path doesn't work, no one will be there to help. Without support from the AU, the Sahel might gain control, but fall into the hands of warlords, resource thieves, or foreign powers eager to take advantage of the situation. That's what made Antonio's mission so important. He wasn't just gathering facts, he was acknowledging something. Quietly, he was recognizing that this wave of African ideas isn't a threat. It's a reflection. A mirror showing a new reality the rest of the continent must now face. This moment shows the African Union both what it could grow into and what it stands to lose if it doesn't evolve quickly. The AU has now heard the Sahel's new voice. The question is whether it can respond without being trapped by its own past. If not, will the rising group of revolutionary nations, ready to tear down old frameworks to build new ones, take over as the continent's center of power? Let's continue. In Burkina Faso, the AU didn't just hear a call for dignity. It witnessed a working example of a different kind of Africa. Now, for the first time in decades, Africa's political center is shifting. It's no longer shaped in conference rooms in Addis Ababa, skyscrapers in Lagos, or along the banks of the Nile. It's coming from the dry, dusty Sahel, where frustration is being reshaped into something fierce, self-directed, and deeply unfamiliar. This transformation wasn't sparked by one single event. It came from disappointment. It came from years of broken aid promises, unclear foreign military missions, drone strikes that missed their targets, and elections that brought more poverty than progress. The anger built quietly until it boiled over. But instead of falling into chaos, countries like Burkina legitimacy shaped by outside powers. In response, they formed the Alliance of Sahel States. This wasn't just another partnership or alliance. It was a clear statement that Africa's borders may stay the same, but its centers of control can change, and should. This new vision defines independence by your ability to manage your own resources, technology, and economy. That's why these countries are building their own food networks, creating gold refineries, cutting ties with French-controlled currencies, and funding homegrown security projects that don't need green lights from Washington or Paris. But this is not about cutting the rest of the world off. This isn't isolation. This shift is about redefining Africa's place in the world, not shrinking it. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré aren't turning inward. They are looking sideways, toward partnerships across the global south, toward self-reliance in farming, toward stronger ties with BRICS, and toward an African Union that protects and defends rather than simply debates. That's why the AU's trip to Burkina Faso wasn't just about that one country. This political shift is spreading. Chad feels it. Guinea feels it. Even Senegal, long seen as a pillar of Western influence, is beginning to sense that something beneath the surface is shifting. The Sahel is proving that you don't need Western approval to lead your people. You just need the trust of citizens who have watched every outside promise fall apart, and control over the things that matter most: land, resources, food, and security. So where does that leave the African Union? Stuck in the middle. On one side are traditional member states that support cautious, shared approaches and slow diplomacy. On the other side is a growing bloc that sees those same values as masks for control. What makes this moment so unstable is that both views are truly African, yet deeply at odds with each other. If the AU tries to weaken the Sahel bloc, it could destroy the very unity it was created to protect. But if it welcomes these new ideas too quickly, it risks upsetting long-standing allies and foreign backers who still control much of the funding. That brings us to the real question: who defines what it means to be African today? Is it the formal institutions and long-standing leaders? Or the young officers training new recruits under Sahel skies, wearing dusty uniforms and pushing forward their own ideas? If the AU doesn't act soon, the Sahel might answer that question for everyone. It could become the example of how post-Western African governments are built. Not by asking permission from the United Nations, not by begging for debt forgiveness, but by telling their own stories, in their own voices, from the ground up. This is not a possibility. It's already happening. And if the African Union wants to matter in this new reality, it must do more than just listen. If the African Union wants to stay relevant in a rapidly changing continent, It must get involved now. Otherwise, it risks becoming a forgotten piece of history, especially as the Sahel continues to break away from old systems. But the question remains, can the AU change fast enough? Or will its absence, in places where decisions are made and crops are grown, define the future of African leadership? The AU was built with the goal of unity, but today it faces a kind of challenge it was never designed to handle. This new challenge is bold, organized, and clear in its goals. The Sahelian Alliance is not just moving forward, it's pushing the rest of Africa to consider a new path. And now, behind closed doors in Addis Ababa, a quiet question is starting to grow. What if Africa's future no longer centers around the AU? What's happening in the Sahel isn't just about soldiers or governments. It's a shift in mindset. It has exposed how weak and outdated Africa's post-colonial political systems have become. For a long time, the AU believed its decisions carried weight, that its authority couldn't be questioned, and that its presence automatically meant influence. But countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are proving that wrong. Not with statements, but with action. These countries didn't ask for permission before cutting ties with ECOWAS. They didn't seek approval before pushing out foreign troops. They didn't wait for support before reshaping their economies or forming new defense partnerships. They moved forward confidently and without delay. So what did the AU do? It watched, it made announcements, it held meetings, but those don't stop bullets. They don't rebuild burned villages or keep young people from disappearing into armed groups. That's the real crisis facing the AU. Not only are outside powers and insurgent groups moving faster than it can respond, but now even its own members are stepping away from its leadership. The fact that a listening mission had to be arranged in Ouagadougou reveals something deeper. The countries the AU claims to represent no longer fully trust its leadership. Traoré didn't bring in Antonio to show off or to be approved. He invited him to test whether the AU still understands the people it was built to lead. There was no hostility, but there was no fanfare either. Yes, the AU was received politely. But there was no need for Burkina Faso to ask for its blessing. The country now follows a different political logic, one where results matter more than process. That way of thinking is spreading fast across the continent. You can already see cracks forming elsewhere. In East Africa, Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo share the same space, but remain deeply divided. Across southern Africa, new political voices are rising to challenge the old guard. In North Africa, the AU holds little influence. And in Central Africa, no one is rushing to fill the space left by collapsing French-backed regimes. The AU's influence isn't being attacked directly, it's being quietly avoided. And that's the real danger. The African Union might not collapse with a loud noise. It might simply fade away. So what does real change look like? First, the AU has to face reality. In this battle over Africa's direction, it can no longer sit on the fence. It must choose whether to keep defending the systems of the past or support the bold new ideas emerging from the Sahel. That means breaking away from dependency on outside donors who tie support to their own rules. It means creating real emergency teams that act fast when people are in danger, instead of just watching from afar. It means empowering local and regional partnerships, sharing decision-making power, and responding to countries that speak with urgency, not just ceremony. The AU's visit to Burkina Faso was a first step, a soft landing in a much harder truth. But listening alone is not enough. Now it must act. And in today's Africa, action doesn't mean holding a conference in a hotel ballroom. It means real investments, solid plans, trained teams, working infrastructure, and above all, courage. Because if the AU waits too long, It may one day find itself looking at a united Africa that no longer flies its flag. The Sahel didn't bring down the AU, but it has revealed just how fragile its grip truly is. Time is running out fast. Can the African Union step up to meet this determined rebellion? Or has the center of power already slipped beyond its reach? The AU stands at a dangerous edge. The ground beneath it is breaking not because of outside forces, but because some of its most restless members have quietly decided they cannot wait any longer. The question is no longer if the AU will lead. Now it is whether it can even keep pace, since the Sahel has already moved ahead. What we see is rebuilding, not just rebellion. What started as isolated coups is becoming a pattern that challenges the very foundation on which the AU was built. For years, unity meant compromise, patience, and agreement. But Burkina Faso and its allies are betting on independence, urgency, and a system they create for themselves. The hard truth is they might be right. The people of Africa have not been well protected by the institutions that were meant to defend the continent after colonial rule. Too often, these organizations have used diplomacy delays and dependency on donors as excuses. Now a new way is rising from the void. This new approach is clearly African in spirit, fast, sometimes rough, and driven by its own power. The African Union now faces its most important challenge since it was founded. It must either become a symbol of something Africa has outgrown or transform into a flexible, ground-up group that adapts to broken sovereignties and new alliances. The AU can no longer try to balance old ways with change. It must choose a side in this new African reality, and that choice will have consequences. To accept the energy coming from the Sahel, the AU will need to discard its old rulebook and see leaders like Traoré and Goïta not as exceptions, but as examples of a new, practical African leadership. Governance must shift to focus on results, not copied systems. Legitimacy should be judged by how well the military defends sovereignty and how strong communities are, not by election calendars. But if the AU clings to the past and old rules that no longer work for much of Africa, it risks losing those same regions completely. This goes beyond politics, money, or ideas. With closer ties to Russia, new ways to fund development, and the chance to build alternative diplomatic networks, the Sahel is already turning its attention to Asia. If this grows and countries like Guinea, Chad, and the Central African Republic join in, the AU might find itself isolated while the rest of Africa forms a new circle around it. This would not only be a diplomatic mistake, it would shake the very foundation of the continent's unity. What do you think? Should the AU make changes and compromises? Or should African nations continue to follow its lead? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Is the era of unchecked power over? If you want to see more videos like this one, hit the bell icon and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to come back for the next video.